The first pale ribbons of light were just beginning to paint the eastern sky above Fort Smith, Arkansas, as Thomas Henderson stirred in his modest wooden bed. The year was 1884, and the frontier town was slowly transforming from a rough outpost into something resembling civilization. Through the thin walls of his boarding house room, Thomas could hear the gentle lapping of the Arkansas River against the ferry dock, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own breathing over the past 3 years since he'd taken up the position of truant officer for the Fort Smith School District. The room was simple but comfortable enough, a single bed with a cornhusk mattress covered in clean cotton sheets, a washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher, a small wardrobe containing his 2 suits and few personal belongings, and a writing desk where he kept his ledgers and correspondence. The floorboards, worn smooth by countless footsteps, creaked softly as Thomas swung his legs out of bed, his feet finding the familiar grooves in the wood. Outside his window, the morning birds were beginning their daily chorus. Cardinals whistled their cheerful songs from the oak trees that lined Garrison Avenue, while mourning doves cooed softly from the eaves of neighboring buildings. The air was cool and crisp this September morning, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke from early rising households beginning their cooking fires, mixed with the earthier smell of the river and the sweet aroma of honeysuckle that still bloomed along the fence posts. Thomas poured water from the pitcher into the basin, the cool liquid shocking his skin awake as he splashed it on his face. He worked up a lather with his shaving soap, the familiar scent of bay rum and lavender filling his small room. The straight razor, inherited from his father, glided smoothly across his jaw with practiced strokes. In the small mirror hanging above the washstand, he could see his reflection, a man of 32 years, with kind brown eyes that held both determination and compassion, features weathered but not hardened by his work on the frontier. After shaving, he dressed methodically in his everyday attire, a white cotton shirt, carefully pressed the evening before, dark wool trousers, and a simple vest. His badge, a small brass pin that identified him as a truant officer, was polished until it gleamed softly in the growing morning light. He pinned it carefully to his vest, a daily reminder of his responsibility to the children of Fort Smith. The boarding house was beginning to wake as Thomas made his way down the narrow staircase, each step producing its own unique creak in the morning quiet. Mrs. Adelaide Murphy, the proprietress, was already in the kitchen, her domain filled with the comforting sounds and smells of breakfast preparation. The cast-iron stove radiated warmth throughout the room, and the scent of fresh biscuits, bacon, and strong coffee created an atmosphere of homely comfort. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," Mrs. Murphy greeted him, her Irish accent still noticeable after 20 years in America. She was a widow of 50, round-faced and perpetually cheerful, who ran her boarding house with efficiency and warmth. "You're up with the birds again, I see." "Good morning, Mrs. Murphy," Thomas replied, taking his usual seat at the long wooden table that dominated the dining room. "The Baxter children have been absent for 3 days now. I plan to visit their homestead this morning." Mrs. Murphy clucked her tongue sympathetically as she set a plate before him, 2 fresh biscuits split and covered with sausage gravy, 3 strips of bacon, and 2 eggs fried just the way he liked them, with the yolks still soft. A cup of strong black coffee followed, steam rising from its surface like morning mist off the river. "Poor mites," she said. "Their fathers probably got them working the late harvest. These farming families don't always see the value in book learning, more's the pity." Thomas nodded, cutting into his biscuit with his fork. The gravy was perfect, creamy and well-seasoned with black pepper and sage. "That's often the case," he agreed. "But the law is the law, and more importantly, those children deserve their chance at education. It's what will lift them out of poverty, give them opportunities their parents never had." As he ate, other boarders began to filter into the dining room. There was Mr. Jameson, a clerk at the Mercantile, who always read yesterday's newspaper while eating, Miss Sarah Collins, a seamstress who did fine work for the wives of the fort's officers, and old Mr. Peterson, a retired cavalry soldier who now worked as a night watchman at the warehouse district. They exchanged quiet morning pleasantries, the comfortable routine of people who shared living quarters but respected each other's privacy. By 7 o'clock, Thomas had finished his breakfast and stepped out onto Garrison Avenue, Fort Smith's main thoroughfare. The street was already showing signs of life, though it was still quiet compared to what it would become by midday. The wooden sidewalks, raised above the dirt street to avoid the mud during rainy seasons, echoed hollowly under his boots as he walked. Fort Smith in 1884 was a town caught between two worlds. To the west lay Indian Territory, still wild and largely ungoverned. To the east lay Arkansas, increasingly settled and civilized. The town itself served as a gateway between these worlds, and nowhere was this more evident than in the variety of people one might encounter on any given day. Thomas's first stop was always the schoolhouse, a two-story frame building painted white with green shutters, located 3 blocks from his boarding house. The Fort Smith Public School was the pride of the community, built just 5 years earlier when the town had finally gathered enough funds and political will to establish a proper educational system. Before that, education had been a haphazard affair of private tutors for the wealthy and church-run schools for some of the poor. The schoolyard was enclosed by a wooden fence, painted the same white as the building. Inside, 2 large oak trees provided shade for the play areas, their leaves just beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. A well with a hand pump stood near the entrance, and Thomas could hear the rhythmic squeaking of its handle as Mr. Cornelius, the school's janitor, filled buckets for the day's cleaning. "Morning, Cornelius," Thomas called out. The elderly black man looked up with a smile. Cornelius had been born into slavery in Georgia but had made his way to Fort Smith after the war, finding work and a measure of respect in this frontier town that many other places wouldn't have afforded him. "Morning, Mr. Thomas. You heading out to the Baxter place?" "I am indeed. Have you heard anything about why the children haven't been attending?" Cornelius paused in his pumping, considering. "My nephew works at the mill, says he saw Mr. Baxter in town buying supplies 2 days ago." Man looked worried, but not sick or injured. "Might be they're just overwhelmed with the harvest." Thomas thanked him for the information and continued to the school's entrance. Inside, the building smelled of chalk dust, ink, and the pine oil used to clean the floors. The familiar scent never failed to remind him of his own school days back in Ohio, before his family had moved west seeking opportunity. Miss Elizabeth Hartley, the head teacher, was already in her classroom preparing for the day's lessons. She was a woman of perhaps 28 years, unmarried and dedicated to her profession with a passion that Thomas deeply admired. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her dress, while simple, was always immaculate. "Good morning, Miss Hartley," Thomas said, removing his hat as he entered her classroom. "Mr. Henderson," she replied, looking up from the arithmetic problems she was writing on the blackboard. "I assume you're here about the Baxter children?" "Yes, ma'am. 3 days absent now." "Have any of the other children mentioned anything?" Miss Hartley set down her chalk and consulted a notebook on her desk. Young Timothy Morrison mentioned that he saw the whole Baxter family in their field when his father drove past their farm yesterday. "All of them working, including little Emma, and she's only 7. Thomas frowned. Emma Baxter was a bright child who loved school, especially reading. For her to be kept home meant the situation must be serious. "I'll ride out there this morning. Is there any work I should take for them to complete at home?" Miss Hartley prepared a packet of assignments, arithmetic problems for 12-year-old James, reading exercises for 10-year-old Mary, and simple letter tracing sheets for young Emma. She wrapped them carefully in brown paper to protect them from the elements. "Please tell them they're missed," she said, handing him the packet. "And Mr. Henderson, be gentle with Mr. Baxter. I know he's a proud man, and proud men don't always take kindly to being told what to do with their own children." Thomas nodded, understanding the delicate balance he would need to strike. "I always try to remember that most parents want what's best for their children, even when they don't always know what that is." Thomas walked to the livery stable on Rogers Avenue, where he kept his horse, a steady bay mare named Prudence. The stable was run by Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant who had the reputation of being the best horseman in Fort Smith. The stable smelled of hay, leather, and horses, a rich, earthy combination that Thomas had come to associate with the freedom of the open frontier. "Guten Morgen, Herr Henderson," Müller greeted him in his thick accent. "Prudence is ready for you. I gave her extra oats this morning. She seemed to know she would be working today." Thomas smiled, patting Prudence's neck as Müller led her out of her stall. The mare nickered softly in greeting, her breath warm against his hand. Müller had already saddled her with Thomas's well-worn saddle, the leather soft and supple from years of use. "Danke, Heinrich," Thomas said, using one of the few German words he knew, which always made the stable master smile. He secured the packet of schoolwork in his saddlebag, along with his water canteen and a small lunch that Mrs. Murphy had prepared, cold biscuits with ham, an apple, and a small jar of pickles. The morning was warming now, the September sun climbing steadily into a clear blue sky. It would be a warm day, but not oppressively so. The ride to the Baxter homestead took him northwest out of town, following the old military road for about 2 miles before turning onto a smaller track that wound through increasingly rural territory. The landscape here was a mixture of small farms carved out of the forest, with fields of corn, cotton, and vegetables interspersed with stands of oak, hickory, and pine. As Prudence walked along at her steady pace, Thomas had time to observe the world around him. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals as it searched for prey. Butterflies, monarchs beginning their long migration south, fluttered among the goldenrod and asters that grew along the roadside. The air was filled with the drowsy hum of insects and the distant lowing of cattle. He passed the Morrison farm, where he could see the family working in their cornfield, the stalks now brown and ready for harvest. Mr. Morrison raised his hand in greeting, and Thomas touched the brim of his hat in response. Further on, he passed the abandoned cabin that had once belonged to a family who had given up and moved back east after 2 years of failed crops. The wilderness was already beginning to reclaim it, with vines growing up the walls and a young oak sprouting through the collapsed roof. The Baxter homestead was situated on 40 acres of reasonably good land, though Thomas knew that Josiah Baxter had struggled to make it profitable. The farm came into view as Prudence crested a small hill, a simple log cabin with a stone chimney, a small barn that had seen better days, and fields of corn and cotton that showed signs of neglect. As he approached, Thomas could see the family in the cotton field. Josiah Baxter was a tall, thin man, prematurely aged by hard work and worry. His wife, Martha, was beside him, her sunbonnet barely shading her weathered face. And there were the 3 children, James, trying to match his father's pace, Mary, working steadily if slowly, and little Emma, who seemed to be spending more time chasing grasshoppers than picking cotton. Josiah saw him coming and straightened up, his expression wary. Thomas dismounted at a respectful distance and tied Prudence to a fence post in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Mr. Baxter," Thomas called out in greeting, walking slowly toward the family. "Henderson," Josiah replied curtly. "I suppose you've come about the children." "I have," Thomas said, keeping his voice friendly but firm. "They've been missed at school. 3 days now." Josiah's jaw tightened. "Can't you see we're in the middle of harvest? Cotton won't pick itself, and if we don't get it in soon, we'll lose everything." You want my children educated? Fine. But they won't get much education if we're starved out of our home. Thomas had heard this argument many times before. He approached it with practiced patience. I understand your situation, Mr. Baxter, I truly do. But the law requires children to attend school, and beyond that, their education is an investment in their future. The law, Josiah spat. The law doesn't put food on my table or pay my debts. Martha Baxter placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. Josiah, she said softly, and Thomas could hear in that one word years of quiet mediation. Thomas decided to try a different approach. Mr. Baxter, what if I could arrange for some help with your harvest? There are older boys in town who could work afternoons and Saturdays. It wouldn't cost you anything, the school board has a small fund for such situations. Josiah's expression shifted from hostility to surprise, then to suspicion. Why would they do that? Because the town council understands that educated children become productive citizens who contribute to the community's prosperity, Thomas explained. And because they recognize that families sometimes face impossible choices. This way, your children get their education, and you get your harvest in. The silence stretched for a long moment, broken only by the buzz of insects and Emma's delighted squeal as she caught a particularly large grasshopper. Finally, Josiah nodded slowly. I suppose that would be acceptable, he said grudgingly. When could these boys start? I can have 2 of them here tomorrow afternoon, Thomas promised. In the meantime, I've brought schoolwork for the children to complete this evening, so they won't fall too far behind. He walked back to Prudence and retrieved the packet of assignments, handing them to Martha, who accepted them with a grateful smile. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. We do want what's best for our children. I know you do, ma'am. That's why I'm here to help, not to punish. After leaving the Baxter homestead with the promise that the children would return to school the following Monday, Thomas continued his circuit of the rural areas surrounding Fort Smith. His next stop was the Sherman place, where he needed to check on young Robert Sherman, who had been suffering from a bout of fever but was reportedly recovering. The ride between farms gave Thomas time to reflect on his work. Being a truant officer in a frontier town was far different from what it might be in an established eastern city. Here, the challenges were not just about lazy children or negligent parents, but about the fundamental struggle for survival that many families faced. The balance between immediate needs and future benefits was a constant negotiation. The Sherman farm was more prosperous than the Baxters, with a proper frame house instead of a log cabin and well-maintained outbuildings. Mrs. Dorothy Sherman was in the garden when Thomas arrived, tending to her late vegetables, pumpkins, winter squash, and turnips. She was a handsome woman of middle years, her graying hair pinned up under a practical bonnet. Mr. Henderson, she called out warmly. How nice to see you. You must be here about Robert. Yes, ma'am. How is he feeling? Much better, thank you for asking. The fever broke 3 days ago, and he's been chomping at the bit to get back to school. The doctor says another day or 2 of rest, and he should be fine. She invited Thomas in for a glass of cool buttermilk, which he gratefully accepted. The Sherman house was comfortable and well appointed, with proper furniture and even some books on a shelf in the parlor. Robert was in his room, propped up in bed with a slate and chalk, practicing his letters. Mr. Henderson, the boy exclaimed when Thomas appeared in the doorway. Robert was 11, with bright red hair and more freckles than anyone could count. Hello, Robert. I'm glad to see you're feeling better. Mother's been helping me keep up with my studies, Robert said proudly, showing Thomas his slate. I've been practicing my multiplication tables and reading from McGuffey's Reader. Thomas spent a few minutes reviewing Robert's work, pleased to see that the boy hadn't fallen behind despite his illness. This was the ideal situation, parents who valued education and made sure their children kept up even when circumstances prevented school attendance. After finishing his buttermilk and complimenting Mrs. Sherman on her garden, Thomas continued on his rounds. He had 3 more stops to make before returning to town, checking on the O'Brien twins who had been absent Monday but returned Tuesday with a note from their mother about a family emergency, visiting the new family that had just moved to the old Garrett place to ensure they knew about the school requirements, and stopping by the Navarro Ranch to speak with them about enrolling their eldest daughter, who had just turned 6. The O'Brien farm was closest, just a mile down the road from the Shermans. The family was Irish Catholic, part of the wave of Irish immigration that had helped build the railroads and then settled along them. Patrick O'Brien was working on repairing his fence when Thomas arrived, his twin boys, Michael and Sean, helping him. "Afternoon, Henderson," Patrick called out in his thick brogue. "The boys told me you were asking after them." "Just making sure everything was all right, Mr. O'Brien. Their teacher was concerned when they didn't appear Monday." "Ah, that was my fault entirely. My brother came through unexpectedly on his way to California, and I wanted the boys to meet their uncle. Should have sent word to the school, but it slipped my mind in all the excitement." The twins, both 13 and identical down to the cowlick in their dark hair, looked appropriately sheepish. Thomas made a note in his ledger and reminded them about the importance of regular attendance, but he could see this was an isolated incident in an otherwise responsible family. The visit to the new family, the Andersons from Tennessee, took longer. They had 3 children of school age and 1 toddler, and had not yet enrolled any of them. Mr. Anderson was initially resistant, claiming he needed the older boys' help with establishing the farm, but Mrs. Anderson was firmly on the side of education. Thomas found, as he often did, that mothers were his greatest allies in ensuring children attended school. "My own mother couldn't read nor write," Mrs. Anderson said, bouncing the toddler on her hip. "I learned my letters from a traveling preacher's wife, and it opened up the whole world to me. I won't have my children growing up ignorant." By the time Thomas had explained the school system, the requirements, and the schedule, and had helped them fill out the enrollment papers, Mr. Anderson had come around to the idea, especially when Thomas mentioned that the older boys could still help with morning and evening chores. The sun was past its zenith when Thomas turned Prudence toward the Navarro Ranch, the last stop on his circuit before returning to town. The ranch was different from the small farms he'd been visiting. It was a proper cattle operation, one of several that had been established in the area as the cattle drives from Texas had made Fort Smith a regular stop. Don Alejandro Navarro had come up from Mexico 20 years ago, first as a vaquero on other people's cattle drives, then gradually building his own small herd. Now he owned 300 acres and ran nearly 200 head of cattle. His ranch house was adobe and timber, built in the Spanish style with a central courtyard, unusual for this part of Arkansas but practical and comfortable. As Thomas rode up, he could hear guitar music drifting from the courtyard, a gentle melody that seemed to capture both joy and melancholy. He dismounted and knocked on the heavy wooden gate. "Quién came a voice from within. "Thomas Henderson, the truant officer," he called back. The gate opened to reveal Miguel, the eldest Navarro son, a young man of about 18 with his father's strong features and serious demeanor. "Senor Henderson, welcome. My father is expecting you." The courtyard was an oasis of coolness, with a small fountain in the center and grapevines growing over wooden arbors to provide shade. Don Alejandro was seated on a bench, a classical guitar in his hands. He was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, with silver threading through his black hair and beard. "Ah, Senor Henderson," he said, setting aside his guitar and rising to shake Thomas's hand. "Please, sit. Miguel, bring our guest some water." Thomas sat on the bench, grateful for the shade and the cool stone beneath him. Thank you for seeing me, Don Alejandro. I understand your daughter Isabella has turned 6. See, last month. My wife, she wishes for Isabella to attend the school, but I have concerns. What concerns you? Don Alejandro was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. We are Mexican, Senor Henderson. Not all in Fort Smith are welcoming to those who are different. I worry about my little Isabella facing unkindness from other children, or worse, from adults who should know better. Thomas understood the man's concerns. Fort Smith, like many frontier towns, was a mixture of people from many backgrounds, and while this often led to a practical tolerance, prejudices still existed. I won't lie to you, Don Alejandro. There may be some children who are unkind, at least at first. Children often fear what they don't understand. But Miss Hartley, who would be Isabella's teacher, is a fair and kind woman who won't tolerate bullying. And I believe that the more children of different backgrounds learn together, the better our community becomes. Miguel returned with water in clay cups, cool and refreshing. As Thomas drank, Senora Navarro appeared with young Isabella. The child was beautiful, with large dark eyes and long black hair tied back with a red ribbon. She clung shyly to her mother's skirts but peeked out with obvious curiosity. Isabella, her mother said gently in accented English, this is Senor Henderson. He helps children go to school. Thomas knelt down to be at the child's eye level. Hello, Isabella. Do you like stories? The girl nodded, still shy but interested. At school, Miss Hartley tells wonderful stories, and she teaches children to read so they can discover stories for themselves. Would you like that? See, yes, Isabella said in a small voice. Thomas spent the next hour with the Navarro family, discussing the practical aspects of Isabella's education. They agreed that Miguel would bring her to school and pick her up each day for the first few weeks, until she felt comfortable. Senora Navarro would prepare her with some basic English phrases, though Thomas assured them that Miss Hartley had experience with children who spoke different languages at home. As he prepared to leave, Don Alejandro walked him to his horse. You are a good man, Senor Henderson. Not all who have authority use it with such wisdom. I try to remember that every child deserves a chance to learn, regardless of where they come from, Thomas replied. Education is the great equalizer. The ride back to Fort Smith was peaceful, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the landscape. Prudence knew she was heading home and picked up her pace slightly, eager for her evening oats and the comfort of her stall. Thomas let her have her head, trusting her to pick the best path along the familiar road. As they neared town, the character of the land changed. The farms became smaller and more numerous, then gave way to houses with proper yards. He could see smoke rising from the chimney of the new Methodist church, where the Ladies' Aid Society was probably preparing for their weekly dinner for the poor. The sound of hammering echoed from the construction site where a new hotel was being built, testament to Fort Smith's growing prosperity. Thomas's path took him past the federal courthouse, an imposing two-story brick building where Judge Isaac Parker, already becoming known as the hanging judge, presided over cases from Indian Territory. Thomas had mixed feelings about Judge Parker. The man was harsh, perhaps overly so, but he was also bringing a measure of law to what had been a lawless territory. The gallows behind the courthouse, capable of hanging 6 men at once, stood as a grim reminder of the price of serious crime. He stopped first at the school to report to Miss Hartley about his day's visits. The afternoon classes were just ending, and children streamed out of the building, their voices raised in the joy of temporary freedom. Thomas smiled, remembering his own school days and that daily burst of energy at dismissal time. Miss Hartley was cleaning her blackboard when he entered, erasing the day's lessons with methodical strokes. "How did your visits go, Mr. Henderson?" Thomas gave her a full report, noting her pleasure when he told her about the arrangement for the Baxter children and Isabella Navarro's upcoming enrollment. "That's wonderful news. I'll make sure to prepare something special for Isabella's first day, to make her feel welcome." "I knew you would. Also, the Anderson children from Tennessee will be starting Monday. 3 of them, William, age 14, Sarah, age 11, and Joseph, age 8. Miss Hartley made notes in her register. "We're nearly at capacity. If the town keeps growing at this rate, we'll need another teacher soon. The school board is aware. They're discussing it at next month's meeting." After leaving the school, Thomas returned Prudence to the livery stable, where Heinrich Müller was waiting with her evening feed already prepared. Thomas spent a few minutes brushing her coat, the repetitive motion soothing after the long day. Prudence stood quietly, occasionally swishing her tail at a fly, content with the attention and the prospect of dinner. "She is a good horse," Müller observed, watching from the stable door. "Patient, like you. It is important in your work, Ja." "Very important," Thomas agreed. "Many of the families I visit are struggling, Heinrich. They need understanding, not judgment. This is why you are good at what you do. Not everyone would ride all over the county to check on children. Some would just mark them truant and levy fines." With Prudence settled for the night, Thomas walked back toward his boarding house, but first decided to stop at Morrison's Mercantile to purchase some supplies. The store was a gathering place in the evenings, where men often congregated to discuss the day's events and exchange news. The Mercantile smelled of 100 different things: coffee beans and pickle brine, leather and tobacco, peppermint sticks and gun oil. Mr. Morrison, a portly man with magnificent matonchop whiskers, was behind the counter discussing the cotton prices with several local farmers. "Evening, Henderson," Morrison greeted him. "Heard you were out at the Baxter place today." News traveled fast in a town the size of Fort Smith. "I was. We've worked out an arrangement to help with their harvest so the children can return to school." One of the farmers, an older man named Garrett, snorted. "In my day, children worked when work needed doing. All this schooling makes them soft." Thomas had heard this argument before too. "Perhaps, Mr. Garrett, but in your day, a man could make a living with just a strong back and willing hands. These days, with the railroad and telegraph, with business becoming more complex, education is necessary for success." "The boy makes a point," said another man, Samuel Roberts, who ran the local newspaper. "The world is changing. Those who don't change with it get left behind." The discussion continued in this vein for some time, with Thomas purchasing his supplies: soap, a new collar for his shirt, some writing paper, and a small bag of peppermint candies that he often carried to give to children, while listening to the various opinions. It was part of his job, he felt, to understand the different perspectives in the community regarding education. As he left the Mercantile, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. The evening was cooling, and the first bats were beginning to emerge, their erratic flight patterns dark against the colorful sky. Thomas walked slowly, enjoying the peaceful end to the day. He stopped briefly at the post office to mail a letter he'd written to his sister in Ohio, telling her about his work and life in Fort Smith. The postmaster, Mr. Jennings, was just closing up but took the letter anyway. "Writing to your sister again?" Jennings asked. "You should bring her out here for a visit. Pretty young lady like her might find herself a husband among all these lonely bachelors." Thomas smiled. "She's quite happy teaching in Cincinnati, but thank you for the thought." When Thomas arrived back at Mrs. Murphy's boarding house, the dining room was already filling with the evening meal crowd. In addition to the regular boarders, Mrs. Murphy often served dinner to townspeople who didn't want to cook for themselves or eat at the rough saloons that served food. Tonight's supper was pot roast with vegetables, carrots, potatoes, and onions all cooked together until tender, along with fresh bread, green beans from Mrs. Murphy's garden, and apple cobbler for dessert. The smell filled the house with warmth and comfort. Thomas took his usual seat, nodding to the familiar faces around the table. Judge Parker's clerk, Matthew Sterling, was there, looking tired after a long day of recording testimony. Dr. Samuel Whitman, one of Fort Smith's 3 physicians, sat across from him, still in his vest despite having removed his coat. "Busy day, Doctor?" Thomas asked. "2 births, 1 broken arm, and a case of what might be diphtheria, though I pray I'm wrong about that last one," Dr. Whitman replied. "And you? I heard you were making the rounds today." "The usual challenges," Thomas said. "Families needing help balancing survival with education." "Speaking of education," Sterling interjected, "Judge Parker was saying just today that he wishes more of the men brought before him could read and write. He believes education might prevent many from turning to crime." "The judge is right," Dr. Whitman agreed. "Ignorance and poverty are the parents of most crime. Your work, Henderson, might be the most important in this town for preventing future lawlessness." The conversation around the dinner table ranged over many topics: the upcoming territorial elections, the possibility of statehood for Indian Territory, the latest fashions from St. Louis that the ladies were discussing, and speculation about whether the railroad would extend a spur line to serve the growing cattle trade. Thomas listened more than he spoke, enjoying the community of the boarding house. These evening meals were one of the pleasures of his life, providing both sustenance and society. Mrs. Murphy's apple cobbler was particularly good tonight, the apples perfectly spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, the crust flaky and golden. After dinner, several of the men retired to the parlor for coffee and pipe smoking. Thomas didn't smoke, but he enjoyed the conversation. Tonight, Roberts from the newspaper was reading aloud from a Mark Twain story in a recent issue of the Atlantic Monthly, his dramatic reading style bringing the humor to life. The parlor was comfortable, with horsehair stuffed furniture that had seen better days but was still serviceable. The wallpaper, a pattern of roses and ivy, was slightly faded but gave the room a homey feeling. A coal oil lamp provided warm light, and the windows were open to let in the cooling evening breeze. By 9 o'clock, Thomas excused himself and retired to his room. He had paperwork to complete, reports on each family visited, notes about upcoming concerns, and a weekly summary for the school board. He lit the oil lamp on his desk and arranged his papers, the familiar routine of documentation that was as much a part of his job as the visits themselves. His pen scratched across the paper as he wrote. September 15, 1884. Weekly report of Truancy Officer Thomas Henderson. Families visited. 1. Baxter family arrangement made for harvest assistance. Children to return Monday. 2. Sherman family Robert recovering from fever, expected return within 2 days. 3. O'Brien family absence explained, isolated incident. 4. Anderson family new arrivals, 3 children enrolled for Monday start. 5. Navarro family Isabella, age 6, to begin attendance next week. Current concerns. Harvest season continues to present challenges for farm families. Several families struggling to afford school supplies. Need for additional space if enrollment continues to grow. Recommendations. Continue fund for Harvest Assistance Program. Consider establishing a supply donation program through churches. Begin planning for potential school expansion. As he wrote, Thomas could hear the sounds of Fort Smith settling in for the night. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, answered by another. The saloon on the next street over was getting rowdy, though not unusually so. Someone was playing a fiddle, the melody drifting on the night air, Sweet Betsy from Pike, a popular tune. He finished his reports and sealed them in an envelope to deliver to the school board secretary tomorrow. Then he pulled out his personal journal, a leather-bound book where he recorded his thoughts and observations about life on the frontier. The work continues to be challenging but rewarding, he wrote. Each family presents its own unique circumstances, its own balance of hope and hardship. The Baxters today reminded me of my own family's struggles when we first came west, that terrible tension between immediate need and future prosperity. I hope the assistance program helps them see that the community values their children's education enough to invest in it. Don Isabella Navarro's concerns about his daughter facing prejudice are, unfortunately, well-founded. But I believe that integration in education is the path to a more harmonious society. When children learn together, they learn about each other, and fear gives way to understanding. Sometimes I wonder what Fort Smith will look like in 20 years. Will it remain this rough frontier town, or will it grow into something more? The children I help today will be the adults who shape that future. Perhaps James Baxter will become a teacher himself, or Isabella Navarro a nurse or shopkeeper. These possibilities are what make the difficult days worthwhile. By 10 o'clock, Thomas was preparing for bed. He performed his evening ablutions at the washstand, the cool water refreshing after the warm day. Through his open window, he could hear the night sounds of Fort Smith intensifying. The saloons were in full swing now, though the respectable boarding house was far enough away that the noise wasn't disturbing. An owl hooted from somewhere near the river, its call lonesome and mysterious. The river itself was a constant presence, its quiet murmur underlying all other sounds like a bass line in a piece of music. Occasionally, he could hear the whistle of a late freight train passing through, heading west into Indian Territory or east toward Little Rock. Thomas changed into his nightshirt, a comfortable garment of soft cotton that had been washed so many times it was thin as paper in places. He turned down his bed, the sheets cool and inviting. Before extinguishing his lamp, he sat on the edge of the bed and said his evening prayers, a habit from childhood that he'd never abandoned. Lord, watch over the children in my care, he prayed quietly. Give their parents wisdom and strength. Help me to serve them with patience and understanding. Protect this town and all who dwell in it. Amen. He blew out the lamp, and the room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Thomas lay back on his pillow, his body tired from the long day of riding and walking. The cornhusk mattress rustled as he adjusted his position, finding the familiar comfortable spot. As Thomas lay in the darkness, his mind gradually quieted from the business of the day. The sounds of the town were becoming more subdued as the hour grew later. The saloons would stay open for several more hours, but the residential areas were settling into sleep. He thought about tomorrow's tasks. He needed to arrange for the boys to help at the Baxter farm, visit the school board secretary with his reports, check on a family on the south side of town where the father had been injured in a mill accident, and prepare for the monthly truancy hearing where persistent cases would be brought before a magistrate. But for now, these concerns could wait. The gentle breeze through his window carried the scent of night-blooming jasmine from Mrs. Murphy's garden. The boarding house itself was quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood and the soft snoring of Mr. Peterson in the next room. Thomas's breathing deepened and slowed. The fatigue of the day settled over him like a comfortable blanket. In that space between waking and sleeping, he heard the distant call of a steamboat on the Arkansas River, its whistle echoing across the water, a reminder that Fort Smith was connected to the wider world beyond. He thought of the children he'd seen today, Emma Baxter chasing grasshoppers, Robert Sherman proudly showing his slate work, Isabella Navarro's shy smile. Each child represented potential, a future yet to be written. His work, though sometimes thankless and often challenging, was helping to write those futures. The night sounds of Fort Smith continued their gentle symphony, the river's constant murmur, the occasional bark of a dog, the distant laughter from a late-night gathering, the wind rustling through the leaves of the oak trees. These sounds had become the soundtrack of his life, as familiar and comforting as a lullaby. Midnight came and went, marked by the chiming of the clock in Mrs. Murphy's parlor downstairs, 12 gentle gongs that barely penetrated Thomas's deepening sleep. The town was quieter now, even the saloons beginning to empty as men made their way home or to their lodgings. In his dreams, Thomas was riding Prudence across an endless prairie, the grass waving like a golden sea. Children ran alongside, laughing and calling out, their faces bright with joy and possibility. It was a peaceful dream, filled with warmth and purpose. Somewhere in the darkness, a night watchman made his rounds, his footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalks. 2 o'clock and all's well, came the distant call, a tradition carried over from older times but still maintained in Fort Smith. The temperature had dropped to a comfortable coolness, and Thomas unconsciously pulled his light blanket higher. The boarding house was deeply quiet now, all its inhabitants lost in their own dreams. Mrs. Murphy, who always rose first, wouldn't begin stirring for another 3 hours. A gentle rain began to fall, so soft at first that it was barely distinguishable from the rustling of leaves. It pattered gently on the roof, adding its rhythm to the night's symphony. The smell of rain on dry earth drifted through the window, earthy and clean. The rain was good for the farmers, Thomas thought in a moment of semi-wakefulness. It would help the Baxter's cotton, make the harvest a little easier. He drifted back to deeper sleep with this comforting thought. The darkest hours before dawn were the quietest in Fort Smith. Even the saloons had closed, their patrons gone home to sleep off their whiskey. The only sounds were natural ones, the rain, which had steadied to a gentle, consistent fall, the river, slightly louder now with the added water, and the occasional call of a night bird. Thomas slept deeply, his body recovering from the day's exertions. In the stable, Prudence dozed standing up, occasionally shifting her weight from one foot to another. The schoolhouse stood empty and waiting, rain washing clean its windows and walls. The farms outside town were dark and still, their inhabitants gathering strength for another day's labor. At 4 o'clock, the first early risers began to stir. Bakers were the first, needing to start their ovens so fresh bread would be ready when the town awoke. The smell of baking bread began to drift through the pre-dawn air, a promise of the coming day. Thomas stirred slightly but didn't wake. His dreams had shifted to memories of his childhood in Ohio, helping his father in their small general store, his mother teaching him his letters at the kitchen table. These memories were colored with the golden haze of nostalgia, peaceful and warm. The rain stopped just before 5 o'clock, leaving the world washed and fresh. The clouds began to break apart, revealing stars in the western sky while the eastern horizon showed the first, faintest hints of the coming dawn. As 5:30 approached, the boarding house began its daily awakening. Mrs. Murphy was first, as always, her footsteps on the stairs barely audible but enough to signal that a new day was beginning. The sounds of her morning routine drifted up from the kitchen, the clanking of the stove grates being cleaned, the thump of wood being added to the fire, the splash of water being pumped. Thomas began to surface from sleep, his mind gradually engaging with the coming day. He didn't open his eyes yet, but lay listening to the familiar sounds of morning preparation. Mr. Peterson's door opened and closed as the old soldier made his way to the outhouse. Miss Collins's light footsteps passed his door on her way downstairs. The birds were beginning their dawn chorus, starting with a single robin and building to a symphony of songs. The rain had brought out the earthworms, and the birds were eager to take advantage of the easy foraging. Thomas finally opened his eyes to see the pale light of dawn illuminating his window. Another day was beginning in Fort Smith, another day of his work as truant officer, another day of small victories and challenges in the cause of education. He sat up, stretching muscles that were a little stiff from yesterday's long ride. His feet found the familiar grooves in the floorboards as he stood. At the washstand, he poured water from the pitcher, noting that it was particularly cold this morning after the rain. As he shaved, Thomas thought about the day ahead. The boys he'd promised to send to the Baxter farm needed to be arranged first thing. He'd speak to Tom and William Garrett, strong boys of 16 and 17 who were finished with their schooling and looking for work. Then he needed to prepare for tomorrow's truancy hearing, ensuring all his documentation was in order. The familiar routine of dressing, shirt, trousers, vest, badge, was performed with the same care as always. Each item was part of his professional identity, part of what gave him the authority to intervene in families' lives for the sake of their children's futures. Breakfast at Mrs. Murphy's was much the same as the day before: biscuits and gravy, eggs, bacon, strong coffee, but the conversation was different. Dr. Whitman had been called out in the night for a difficult birth, and he shared the happy news that both mother and baby were doing well. Judge Parker's clerk mentioned that there would be a significant trial next week, a cattle rustling case that would bring people from all over the territory. Thomas ate steadily, fueling himself for another day of work. The rain had left the air fresh and clean, and through the dining room windows, he could see that it would be a beautiful day. The trees sparkled with raindrops catching the morning sun, and puddles in the street reflected the blue sky. After breakfast, Thomas made his way to the school, his boots splashing through puddles on the wooden sidewalks. The town was fully awake now, with shops opening, people going about their business, and children, those not needed for farm work, making their way to school. Miss Hartley was already there, as always, preparing for the day's lessons. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson. Did you arrange for help for the Baxters?" "I'm on my way to do that now," Thomas replied. "The Garrett boys should be willing. They're good workers and could use the money." He found Tom and William Garrett at their father's shop, helping to unload a shipment of goods from a wagon. They were eager for the work, especially when Thomas explained that the school board would pay them a fair wage. Within an hour, they were on their way to the Baxter farm, with instructions to work hard and be respectful. As Thomas stood outside the schoolhouse, watching children file in for their morning lessons, he reflected on the continuous nature of his work. Every day brought new challenges, families in crisis, children whose futures hung in the balance, the constant negotiation between immediate needs and long-term benefits. But every day also brought rewards. Children who had been absent returning to school, their faces bright with the joy of learning. Parents who initially resisted coming to understand the value of education. The slow but steady progress of civilization in this frontier town. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the damp earth and creating little wisps of steam from the puddles. The sounds of Fort Smith continued their daily rhythm, hammering from construction sites, the calls of merchants, the laughter of children, the steady clip-clop of horses on the streets. Thomas adjusted his badge, that small symbol of his authority and responsibility, and set off for his next task. There would be families to visit, reports to file, problems to solve. But there would also be successes to celebrate, progress to note, futures to help shape. As he walked, he passed the Navarro wagon coming into town, little Isabella sitting between her parents, wearing a new dress that her mother had obviously made special for her first day of school next week. The child waved shyly at Thomas, and he touched the brim of his hat in response, smiling. This was his life in Fort Smith, a constant cycle of challenges and rewards, of helping families navigate the difficult balance between survival and advancement, of ensuring that children had the chance to learn and grow and become more than their parents could have imagined. The day stretched ahead, full of possibility and purpose. And tomorrow would bring more of the same, and the day after that, each day building on the last, creating through small, patient steps a better future for the children of Fort Smith and the frontier beyond. The town continued its daily symphony of sounds, productive, chaotic, alive. And Thomas Henderson, truant officer, continued his patient work, one child, one family, one day at a time, helping to write the future of the American frontier through the simple but powerful tool of education. As the noon sun reached its peak, Thomas made his way through the dusty streets, his mind already on the afternoon's visits. The work never ended, but neither did the satisfaction of knowing that every child he helped into a classroom was a victory for the future. In the great tapestry of Fort Smith's growth from frontier outpost to civilized town, his thread was small but essential, woven through with patience, compassion, and an unshakable belief in the power of education to transform lives. The sounds of the schoolhouse, children reciting their lessons, Miss Hartley's gentle corrections, the scrape of chalk on slate, drifted through the open windows. These were the sounds of progress, of civilization taking root in the wild frontier. And Thomas Henderson, in his quiet, methodical way, was one of the gardeners tending to these precious seeds, ensuring they had the chance to grow strong and tall in the challenging soil of the American West.